You think you know Genesis. You've heard the stories since childhood: creation, Eden, Adam and Eve, the serpent, the fall. These are the foundational images etched into your understanding of human origins. But what if that familiar narrative is only the surface? What if, hidden beneath that well-worn storyline, there exists an entirely deeper version? One far more ancient, more structured, and more challenging than anything we were taught. For centuries, the Book of Genesis has shaped how we see ourselves, as beings created in God's image who fell from grace and then waited through ages for redemption. But few realize that within early Jewish and Christian traditions, another book was preserved, a parallel record of creation, covenants, and cosmic conflict. Not a contradiction to Genesis, but an extension. Not a replacement, but a revelation. And because it threatens to shift our entire framework of sacred history, it was excluded from the Bibles we read today. This book is called the Book of Jubilees. Once revered among the Essenes at Qumran, once quoted by early church fathers, it eventually vanished from mainstream theology. Why? Because it doesn't just retell Genesis, it reframes it. It maps out creation and history in sacred cycles, introduces laws long before Moses, and portrays a spiritual war that began not at Sinai, but at the dawn of time. In doing so, it asks a dangerous question. Do we really know where we came from? If the version of the story we've always known has already shaped the beliefs of millions, imagine what might happen if the full version, the hidden half, were finally revealed. How many things would need to be rethought? How many doctrines would need to be re-examined? And how many people would feel as though their understanding of God, humanity, and history had only just begun? This is not about fantasy or conspiracy. This is about recovering a missing piece of our sacred inheritance. It's about asking, what if the Book of Jubilees had remained in our canon? Would the theology we teach today still look the same? Would grace and law be viewed as opposites or as eternal partners? And more urgently, were key ideas removed from Scripture not because they were false, but because they were too ancient, too complex, or too powerful for institutions to preserve? The opening of Genesis is poetic and profound, but the opening of Jubilees is personal and precise. Genesis begins with a sweeping proclamation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But Jubilees begins with a conversation, an intimate divine revelation to Moses on Mount Sinai. One tells of creation. The other tells Moses why he must remember it, preserve it, and pass it on as law, not just memory. Side by side, they form a split screen. One shows the visible world, the other reveals its sacred architecture. And so the door creaks open, not into a myth, but into a timeline. A sacred chronology said to be dictated by the angel of the presence during Moses' 40 days on the mountain. But if this revelation was truly given, why isn't it in your Bible? What happened to this voice from the summit? The next segment will trace the long path from Sinai to silence, and why the Book of Jubilees was left behind. If Genesis is a sketch drawn with sweeping strokes, the Book of Jubilees is an oil painting layered with rich colors and precise detail. Each line carefully positioned to show not just creation, but the rhythm beneath it. In Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve seems brief. They are made, they fall, and they are cast out. But in the Book of Jubilees, that moment of exile doesn't come in an instant. We are told they lived in the garden for 7 full years before the fall. 7 years of harmony, instruction, and covenant, until in the 8th year, everything changed. This is not a contradiction of Genesis. It is its completion. The Book of Jubilees does not rewrite the story. It restructures it. Every major event from creation to the patriarchs is placed within a sacred framework of time, broken into 49-year cycles called Jubilees. History is not random, but ordered, not chaotic, but musical. Like a divine symphony, time unfolds with a pulse, and each generation plays its part in a pattern laid down from the beginning. In Genesis, we read of events, but often without context or timing. Jubilees gives both. It names the years, marks the seasons, and assigns significance to when and how things happen. The fall doesn't just happen, it happens on the 14th day of the 2nd month. Noah's sacrifice after the flood is not just a reaction of gratitude, it is a covenantal renewal at a predetermined time within a sacred calendar. Time in Jubilees is not a line, it is a spiral, returning again and again to appointed moments where heaven meets earth. This view challenges how we interpret the flow of history itself. If time is cyclical, not linear, if divine patterns have shaped humanity's journey from the start, then our own age is not separate from sacred history, but woven into it. We are not after the fact. We are still inside the story. To understand this shift, imagine mapping Genesis side by side with Jubilees. One moves forward loosely, like a memoir. The other moves in structured pulses, like a divine ledger. The difference is not in the events themselves, but in how we're meant to see them. One sees what happened. The other asks why it happened when it did, and who ordained the moment. And if humanity were to adopt this framework today, if we began to see our own time within a sacred rhythm, how would it change the way we live, the way we wait, the way we repent? What if the chaos of history is not as chaotic as we thought, but a cycle of return, correction, and covenant? The Book of Jubilees doesn't just give us more information, it gives us a new lens. It shows that from the beginning, divine law was not introduced suddenly at Sinai. It was always there, and those who lived under that law were not priests in Israel, but the very first men, Adam, Seth, and Enoch. We've been taught to believe that God's law began with Moses, etched into stone at Sinai, delivered to a wandering people, and established as the foundation of Israel's covenant. But what if that isn't where it started? What if the law, the true law, divine and eternal, had already existed long before Israel, long before Moses, even long before the flood? The Book of Jubilees makes a bold claim, one that shifts the entire timeline of sacred history. Adam, the first man, was given commandments. He kept the Sabbath. He knew the laws of purity. He offered sacrifices, and after him, his son Seth continued in the same path. Enoch walked in righteousness, not as a mystical figure lost in time, but as a keeper of divine ordinances. Noah, emerging from the ark, built an altar not by instinct, but by tradition. And Abraham, often remembered as the man of faith, was also a man of law, observing commandments, festivals, and dietary codes centuries before they were codified at Sinai. This view changes everything. It reveals that God's expectations were never arbitrary or newly invented. They were built into creation. The moral and spiritual laws, justice, mercy, purity, humility, were already known. They were not invented for Israel. They were entrusted to humanity from the beginning. What changed was not God's will, but human memory. Humanity chose to forget. And if there were laws, then there must have been transgressions. And if there were transgressions, then there must have been judgment. That raises the question, what were the patriarchs being judged by? What standard defined righteousness for Cain, or for the people destroyed in the flood, or for Sodom and Gomorrah? The Book of Jubilees answers with clarity. There was a standard. It was sacred. It was known. And it was broken. This realization shakes modern assumptions. Many Christians separate law and grace, placing the law with Moses and grace with Christ. But if Adam had law, if Noah offered sacrifices, if Abraham kept holy days, then grace was not a reaction to law. It was a companion to it from the beginning. Sin was not born out of ignorance, but out of betrayal. The fall was not an accident. It was a conscious rejection of a known covenant. Imagine exploring each patriarch through this lens. Adam as the first priest, Enoch as the first prophet, Noah as the restorer of order, Abraham as the covenant keeper, each one embodying a role not as pioneers of faith alone, but as custodians of divine law. Their obedience was not innovation, it was remembrance. This opens the door for deeper theological questions. If the law predated Sinai, when did grace begin? Was it offered in Eden, even as Adam fell? Was it present in the ark as the waters rose? Was it woven into Abraham's altar on Mount Moriah? Perhaps grace too has always been there, silent, steady, waiting for the heart to turn back to the law, not as burden, but as blessing. We might then compare the laws before Sinai and those given at Sinai, not to find contradictions, but to discover whether the difference is in language or in essence. Were the commands merely restated, or were they expanded to suit a nation rather than a family? If the patriarchs knew the law, kept it, and lived by it, then history turns on a deeper hinge. It's no longer the story of a God slowly revealing his will. It becomes the story of a humanity that once walked with the will of God, then drifted into forgetfulness, and is now being called to remember. And when we realize that the law is older than Moses, we must ask, why did humanity still fall into darkness? Who led them astray? Who whispered rebellion into the hearts of those who knew better? The next chapter begins not with humanity alone, but with the one who deceived them, and the hidden war that began long before Eden closed its gates. In the Book of Jubilees, the serpent is not the true culprit. Behind the slithering figure lies a far more ancient mind, one with intention, patience, and an agenda that reaches beyond Eden. That mind belongs to Satan, not as a vague symbol of evil, but as a deliberate actor in the divine narrative. His name in Jubilees is Mastema, and his role is not incidental. He is the architect of rebellion. According to Jubilees, Adam and Eve lived in Eden not for days or months, but for 7 years in harmony. 7 years of light, unbroken communion, and covenantal instruction. Then came the 8th year. On the 14th day of the 2nd month, an exact date preserved in heavenly record, Satan moved. He did not strike with force. He waited, he studied, and then he entered, cloaked in the form of the serpent, with one goal: to rupture the covenant between humanity and God. This was not a temptation in the modern sense. It was not a stumble or an accident. It was a targeted assault. Eden was not simply a garden. It was the first sanctuary, a place of divine order. To violate it was to ignite a war. Satan's whisper was not just a lie. It was the first strike in a cosmic rebellion. If the fall was an act of war, then sin is not just moral failure. It is the echo of an ancient conflict. Humanity did not simply err. We were ambushed. And the one who led that assault had been preparing, watching, waiting. This perspective reframes everything. Genesis describes the moment with restraint, a serpent, a conversation, a choice. Jubilees strips away the symbol and reveals the strategy. Satan is not a late addition to the story. He is its earliest adversary, already at work before humanity even knew what evil was. This opens the door to a deeper examination. How does the portrayal of Satan differ between Genesis and Jubilees? What does it mean that he was already present, already planning, already positioned? And if he existed before the creation of man, what was his true origin? Was the fall of man really the beginning, or just the next phase of a greater rebellion? After Eden fell, Satan did not retreat. He expanded, and he did not act alone. He had allies, beings who once stood in the courts of heaven, now fallen. In the next chapter, we meet them, the watchers, the betrayers, the ones who came down. Before there was Israel, before there were priests, temples, or Levitical codes, there was an altar, built not in Jerusalem, but in the shadows of Eden, raised not by a nation, but by a man, Adam. And the first blood spilled on holy ground was not Abel's, but that of a lamb, offered by Abel himself. This was not the start of religion. It was the continuation of a sacred pattern, the offering of life in exchange for communion with the divine. The Book of Jubilees reveals a long and unbroken line of sacrifices stretching from Eden to the mountains of Ararat. Adam, though fallen, was not abandoned. He was instructed. He taught his sons to worship, not with empty words, but with offerings. Abel obeyed with reverence, Cain with defiance. The result was not just fratricide, but the rupture of a sacred rhythm. And still, the pattern continued. Seth, the appointed heir, built again. Enoch walked with God. And then came Noah, stepping out of the ark into a world washed clean of violence. And the first thing he did was build an altar. Noah's offering was not spontaneous gratitude, it was covenant renewal. In the very act of sacrifice, Noah was reconnecting heaven and earth. He took the clean animals set aside for this purpose and offered them in fire. The scent, Jubilees tells us, was pleasing to God, and in that smoke a promise rose: never again. The altar became a meeting place, and the sacrifice became a signature, a binding seal of restored relationship. This was not ritual for ritual's sake, it was response. Mankind, though broken, still bore memory of Eden, and in offering what was pure, they were echoing the original design. Every altar was a return, every sacrifice a cry. We remember. Jubilees frames these acts not as precursors to the Mosaic law, but as primordial worship, instinctive, intimate, costly. To trace this path is to rediscover a forgotten geography of devotion. From Eden to Ararat, the line of altars tells a story of loss, of hope, of reaching back. Each flame, each slain lamb, each prayer uttered through rising smoke was a way for man to say, though exiled, we are not severed. Imagine mapping the altars of history. Adam's first stones, Abel's obedient offering, Seth's inherited devotion, Noah's post-flood covenant, and then Abraham, who would soon raise his own altar on Mount Moriah. Each step is a layer, each name a torch passed down. To compare their sacrifices is to uncover a theology older than Sinai. Abel gave from the firstborn, Noah gave from the clean, Abraham gave from the promise. All offered what was most precious, and in return they received more than pardon. They received purpose. Noah did not end the covenant. He reignited it, and as the earth healed from judgment, his offering lit the path forward. But someone had to carry the flame. Someone had to hold the memory and pass it on. That someone was Abraham. Abraham is often remembered for his faith, the man who believed God and was counted righteous. But in the Book of Jubilees, he is more than a man of belief. He is a man of obedience, precision, and covenantal knowledge. Long before the tablets at Sinai, Abraham observed the Sabbath, knew which animals were clean, and offered sacrifices according to divine instruction. He did not improvise worship. He followed a law passed down through generations, safeguarded in secret. Jubilees describes him as being taught by the angel of the presence, a heavenly messenger who revealed the statutes of the Most High. This was not symbolic, it was direct transmission. Abraham did not invent devotion, he restored it. Every altar he built marked not only a promise with God, but a remembrance of ancient ways. In Gerar, Bethel, Hebron, he built, he taught, he preserved. Wherever he went, he established order. His household followed set times and sacred rhythms. He taught his sons not only to trust, but to walk in obedience. Jubilees shows him as the link between the antediluvian patriarchs and the people of Israel. He did not belong to a new religion. He was the inheritor of Edenic worship, the one who kept alive what Adam knew, what Enoch walked in, what Noah preserved on the other side of the flood. His faith was not blind, it was rooted. He believed because he had been shown. He obeyed because he understood. His knowledge of God was not theoretical, it was covenantal. He recognized the voice of the same God who walked in Eden, who closed the ark, who called him from Ur. In that voice, he heard not novelty, but continuity. To understand Abraham in this light is to recover a forgotten identity. He was not just the father of a nation, he was the bearer of a divine pattern. Before Israel had priests, Abraham had altars. Before the law was codified, he lived by it. Not to earn favor, but to honor memory. What would it look like to trace his journey not as a migration, but as a restoration of faith? Each location he stopped in becomes a sacred node, a return point in the map of divine history. A series of sparks meant to keep the fire alive. So if Abraham knew the law, and the patriarchs before him kept it, and the Sabbath itself was sanctified at creation, then why was the Book of Jubilees hidden? Who feared its testimony? Who had something to lose if this ancient order was remembered again? The Book of Jubilees was not removed because it was wrong. It was removed because it revealed too much. It dared to speak in detail where others were vague. It named what others hinted at. And in doing so, it crossed an invisible line, not of doctrine, but of control. In the early centuries of the Church, leaders faced an overwhelming task. A flood of ancient writings circulated, texts attributed to Enoch, Jubilees, and other voices from the edge of sacred memory. Faced with this deluge, decisions had to be made: what stays, what goes, and more crucially, who decides. The canon was not a neutral product of consensus. It was an outcome shaped by power, fear, and institutional survival. Jubilees was dangerous. It taught that the law did not begin with Moses, but with creation itself. It asserted that divine commandments were not Jewish innovations, but eternal patterns. It exposed the reality of the angelic rebellion, of spiritual warfare woven through history. It portrayed humanity not as ignorant, but willfully rebellious, conscious in its defiance. These claims were not easy to domesticate. They could not be reduced to allegory or moral lesson. They demanded reckoning. The guardians of orthodoxy needed clarity, simplicity, teachability. A story that began with Moses was easier to manage than one that traced back to Eden. A fallen angel called Satan was manageable. An entire host of celestial watchers less so. Jubilees pushed too close to the flame, and when it did, the hand that held the curtain chose to close it. The rejection of Jubilees was not an academic critique. It was a theological defense, not of truth, but of control. If Jubilees were accepted, it would challenge every catechism built on the assumption that the law was new, that evil was symbolic, that worship began at Sinai. Its inclusion would shake the foundation, not of faith, but of the system built around it. And so, it was shelved, not denounced, but forgotten, not burned, but buried. Yet its words remained, preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls, echoed by early church fathers, whispered across centuries, like light behind a veil, always threatening to break through. This raises a question no historian can avoid. Was the canon shaped by divine providence or institutional preservation? If the Book of Jubilees had never been hidden, would the early church have formed differently? Would our understanding of worship, of obedience, of the unseen realm have taken another path? But perhaps the most unsettling part of Jubilees is not its calendar or its commandments. It is the war it describes, a cosmic battle, a fall not of men, but of beings far older, celestial traitors who descended not just to corrupt, but to claim. What they left behind was not just sin, but something far more terrifying. In the next segment, we confront them. Humanity did not fall alone. We were pushed by those who once stood in the courts of heaven. The Book of Jubilees unveils one of the most staggering episodes in sacred history, the rebellion of the Watchers. These were not demons or dark spirits, but holy angels, appointed guardians over mankind, sent to teach, to guide, to protect. But they saw the daughters of men, desired them, and crossed the threshold. They took wives, bore children, and the result was Nephilim, giants of terrifying stature, neither fully human nor purely divine. Beings born not of covenant, but of corruption. The world spiraled. With the Watchers' descent came forbidden knowledge, sorcery, weapons of war, unclean medicine, secrets of the heavens twisted for pride. The Nephilim ruled with violence. Blood cried from the ground. Justice delayed turned into justice unleashed. Jubilees clarifies that the flood was not merely a response to human sin, but a divine strike against an invasion. Not a cleansing of bad behavior, but the purging of an altered creation. The human genome had been infiltrated. The spiritual hierarchy had fractured. It was not just mankind that had failed. Heaven's own emissaries had turned. And in that breach, everything collapsed. Moral law became meaningless. Fear replaced faith. Sacrifice turned into manipulation. Cities of men became altars of blood. The pre-flood world became a theater of supernatural chaos, where light and darkness warred in forms no human eye was meant to witness. The sin of the Watchers was not just disobedience, it was treason against creation itself. Their fall birthed an age of monstrosity, and even after their destruction, echoes of that defilement lingered, in names, in myths, in bloodlines too stubborn to die. Today, many traditions dismiss Nephilim as legend, Watchers as metaphor. But what if they were real? What if the very reason for the flood is something most sermons avoid? Not because it's irrelevant, but because it's terrifying. And yet, in the shadows of that story lies a thread of hope. Jubilees does not end with disaster. It moves toward restoration, toward a promise that one would come, not born of rebellion, but of righteousness. One who would undo what the Watchers began, cleanse what the Nephilim defiled, and reclaim a world hijacked by darkness. So yes, the fall began in heaven, but redemption too was always written in the stars. And in the next segment, we begin to follow the signs of that coming light. The Book of Jubilees never names the Messiah, but his presence reverberates through every page, like a melody remembered from a dream. He is foretold not in royal decrees or prophetic thunder, but in the quiet alignment of laws, promises, and patterns, whispers that speak of a coming Redeemer, one who will walk in the very footsteps of the first covenant. This figure is not imagined as a conqueror or a political liberator. He is described by the shape of his life. He will honor the Sabbath, guard the commandments, and live by the sacred ordinances written not just on stone, but into the fabric of creation. He will not abolish the law, but fulfill it with clarity and compassion. He is the embodiment of both justice and mercy, sent not to erase what came before, but to awaken what had long been forgotten. Jubilees positions this Messiah as the hinge of human history, not by the volume of his words, but by the perfection of his obedience. He will not come to make a new covenant, but to restore the original one. The same law given to Adam, embraced by Enoch, guarded by Noah, and lived by Abraham. He will call humanity back to that forgotten path, not through fear, but by showing that it was always the road to life. In the age of lawlessness, he will walk in complete righteousness. In a world that traded eternity for pleasure, he will bear the cost of return. He will be misunderstood by many, resisted by the powerful, yet known by those who still hear the ancient voice. The Book of Jubilees doesn't scream his name, but it builds a frame around his silhouette. It whispers to those with ears to hear. The Messiah was always part of the design. He does not arrive late in the story. He was there in the very first promise. If this is true, then the Gospels are not a rupture from the old, but its crescendo. Grace did not replace the law, it revealed its heart. This changes everything, and it raises deeper questions still. Is this Messiah, the one hinted in Jubilees, the same one revealed in the New Testament? Does Enoch echo the same vision? Could the scattered fragments of lost books form a fuller picture of who he truly is? The trail does not end here. It widens, and we must follow. The Book of Jubilees was never meant to stand alone. It is not an isolated relic, but a bridge linking Eden to Enoch, the Watchers to the flood, the the covenant to the cosmic order. When read alongside the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants, a larger, more intricate tapestry begins to emerge. These texts, once read together in the caves of Qumran, echo the same spiritual drama. A battle that begins in heaven, unfolds on earth, and pulls every living soul into its current. Jubilees doesn't merely retell Genesis, it reframes it in a cosmic context, one already mapped by Enoch's visions and punctuated by the tragedies recounted in Giants. Together, they form the contours of a lost theology, one that doesn't shy away from supernatural conflict, that acknowledges angelic rebellion, and that reveals the layers of divine order humanity was meant to guard. In this view, the law is not merely a list of commands, but the very rhythm of the universe, and Jubilees is its metronome. When these texts were excluded from the canon, something profound was lost. Not just alternative details, but the scaffolding that held the entire story together. Without them, Genesis can seem like a beginning with missing context, and Revelation like an ending without a roadmap. Jubilees was the keystone, positioned between what was seen and what was still to come. And perhaps the most dangerous thing about the Book of Jubilees isn't what it claims outright, but what it ignites in the reader, the desire to look deeper, to pick up the fragments and reassemble the whole, to question not only what we've been told, but why we've been told so little. This opens the door to a deeper series of inquiries. What exactly did the early church understand when they quoted these texts? What caused the shift from reverence to rejection? And what truths might we recover if we dare to read again what was once deemed too bold, too complex, or too divine for the masses? In the end, the question is no longer, what does the Book of Jubilees say? But, why were we never taught any of this? From that question, the real journey begins.